going to be moving through the process of planning for success by deconstructing standards. It's important to note that this is part 2 of a 3-part series. Part 1 focused on priority standards, and in part 3, we'll be moving toward creating those aligned lesson targets and lesson objectives. But for right now, let's go ahead and move through that process of planning for success by deconstructing standards. During our time together, you'll be able to gain a deeper understanding of the difference between that phrase you've all heard, unpacking a standard, and deconstructing a standard. You'll also be able to observe me unpack a specific standard and then also deconstruct that standard. So let's go ahead and dive into identifying the difference between unpacking a standard and deconstructing a standard. When you unpack a standard, you're unpacking a standard so that you can understand what students are expected to know once the skill has been taught. And unpacking a standard also supports in developing appropriate lessons that are aligned to assessments and the grade level standard. Basically, when you unpack a standard, it's helping to provide you with a pathway to develop or to create aligned grade level assessments, both formative and summative. So I want you to think about when you've unpacked, if you've unpacked a standard in the past. You were looking for key pieces within that standard, and then you were asked to identify alignment between maybe your student activity or an assessment or an exit item. That's why you unpacked. I want to talk about deconstructing. When we deconstruct a standard, we're analyzing that standard to determine what students should know and be able to do, not how you'll assess it, but what students need to know before they can even achieve mastery on an assessed item. We deconstruct also to identify the skills that are essential to achieve success on a specific standard. When you deconstruct, which is, like I said, one of my most favorite steps in the planning process, you are literally tearing a standard apart. You're breaking it down to its base level to identify every essential skill that fits into that standard. What do students have to know to be able to show mastery on a specific standard? Big hits when we talk about unpacking. It's a process that many of us use, many of us have mastered because it's relatively simple. It's anchored to a rubric, if you will, that's talking about nouns, verbs, and concepts. When you unpack a standard, you're identifying those 3 big things: nouns, verbs, concepts. And typically, it's the first step in understanding what is to be taught. Now, when we deconstruct, it's a process that many skip. I would say in probably 95% of PLCs that I've attended, this process is skipped. And the funny thing is, when I've had the opportunity to push in and facilitate PLCs, this is the process where educators actually shine. When you begin to ask a teacher or an instructional leader, how will the kid actually achieve mastery on this unpacked standard? What do they have to know? This is where educators really begin to think out of the box, and you can see their content expertise shine. We deconstruct also to support in identifying prior knowledge. That is the critical component of why we deconstruct. How do you think identifying prior knowledge supports in the planning process? Have you ever been asked to identify the possible upcoming or predict the potential misconceptions? Okay. How can you predict a misconception if you've not first deconstructed a standard and broke it down to its base level? And then after you've assessed, often you're asked to identify the gaps, analyze an assessment item and student data, and let me know what was the gap. Well, if I've not deconstructed my standard, I might not know. But the process that you begin to engage in when you really are identifying the gaps and the misconceptions, you're living in the realm of deconstructing. Now we've talked about the difference between unpacking and deconstructing. I want you to have the opportunity to observe the process. So let's unpack. That's where we're going to start. Let's unpack a standard. Remember, as I mentioned a moment ago, and as that visual showed you, it's anchored to 3 pieces. You're going to circle the verbs, underline the nouns, and determine the concepts. Here's the reality. You can circle, box, square, highlight. It doesn't matter as long as you identify the verbs, nouns, and concepts. And remember that unpacking a standard will support you in creating aligned learning targets and objectives. So it's a critical first step in the process of planning. Here is a 5th grade reading standard. I've actually unpacked 2. I've unpacked 5.8b and 5.6f. You can see where I have highlighted the verbs, the action words, analyze, make, use. You can also see where I have identified the nouns, relationships, conflict, evidence, inference. And now the big concepts, among the characters, and to support understanding. Now, I have seen PLCs spend 20 minutes in a debate and sparring over an unpacked standard. Y'all, 3 to 5 minutes tops. And sometimes you can really get it done in about 90 seconds. Don't live here. Unpack it, talk about it, discuss very quickly the high leverage verb or the rigorous word. What are the nouns and what are the big ideas? And keep it moving. We've unpacked it. That was that little rubric, nouns, verbs, big ideas or concepts. Now what? Now we deconstruct. Again, this is my favorite part of the planning process. Why? Because this is where educators shine. So you now have on your screen where I've unpacked 5.6f. Let's deconstruct. I'm going to make inferences and use text evidence or use evidence to support understanding. What do I need to be able to infer? I gotta know how to use my schema, my background knowledge, and my text evidence. Without knowing how to use those things, I'm not going to be successful with an inference. But what else? I need to have the ability to predict, draw conclusions, and make generalizations. So if in any of those 2 buckets, use my schema, background knowledge, text evidence, and the ability to predict, draw conclusions, make generalizations, if I'm missing any of those skills, I'm already going to have a misconception. And what else? The identification of what? Intended audience, text features. Am I familiar with a genre? We know that inference can be tested in multiple ways within different genres. That's why we need to know those text features and intended audience. These are just some of the components that might rise to the top when educators begin to spar about, hey, let's deconstruct this standard. So we've unpacked it. That was the simple process. That was the rubric of nouns, verbs, and big ideas. But when we deconstructed it, we broke it down to really that prior knowledge bank. So for any of you that live in your PLCs and are you're required to create a no-show chart, the deconstruction process will really help you with that no column. All those prior knowledge statements, those skills, those prerequisites, those derive when you deconstruct a standard. When we go back to the use of schema, background knowledge, and text evidence, I'm going to go deeper into annotating with a purpose, identifying key ideas, and eliminating distractors. Where would I see that? I'm still going to see it on the no side. Now let's tie the first two parts of this series together. Remember, part one was anchored to priority standards, and what we just now did was we unpacked and we deconstructed. Let's tie it together. Identify the priority standards. How? Will it be tested? If so, how and when? Is it required for the next phase of learning? And what guided this decision? Was it your district scope and sequence, your YAG, state assessment, or even a unit assessment? And then what have we just moved through? The process of unpacking a standard for the show statements of your no-show chart. This will help you as you move into phase 3 of this series. We unpacked it using that rubric, nouns, verbs, and concepts. It tells us what mastery will look like. And then we move through deconstructing it. We tore it apart to identify prerequisite skills, what students should already know. And it will support with predicting misconceptions or even identifying the gap after assessment. And it will support you with creating the learning target. So we know for this part of the series, we've deconstructed and we unpacked. Part 3 will move to how to create learning targets that are aligned to the deconstructed skill. As always, there's a call to action. Instructional leaders for excellence, action, and development. We aren't just talking about it, we are about it. Be intentional about your planning practices. Create a crosswalk with your staff for what you're already doing and you're doing well, and how can it be elevated. There is a specific podcast that I put out regarding embracing the double pedal. How do we elevate our toolkit? How do we add value to what we're already doing really well? And provide context, the necessary context to help others embrace and value this new learning or these new set of skills. Model the practice of deconstructing over and over again. You can't expect people to get it the first time you roll it out. But in time, if you're consistent, you will show gains. And be patient with yourself and others. And where I live and what I believe, support, support, support. Support those around you. Thank you for joining me. I hope this learning was meaningful to you. I would love to connect with you. You can find me on Twitter at Misty Green Eiley.